When Germany launched its massive invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the German army believed it possessed the most powerful armored forces in the world. German panzer divisions had already crushed Poland, defeated France and pushed across much of Europe using fast-moving tanks supported by aircraft and mechanized infantry. The strategy known as Blitzkrieg relied heavily on speed, coordination and powerful armored units breaking through enemy lines. German commanders were confident that the same tactics would quickly defeat the Soviet Union. At the beginning of the invasion, many German officers believed the Soviet army was poorly organized and equipped with outdated weapons. Early battles seemed to confirm this belief as German forces rapidly advanced deep into Soviet territory, capturing thousands of prisoners and destroying large numbers of Soviet vehicles. But as the fighting continued, German tank crews began encountering a new enemy machine that they had never seen before. This tank looked different from most armored vehicles used during the early years of the war. Its shape was lower and more angled, its armor appeared thicker, and its wide tracks allowed it to move easily through mud and snow where many other tanks became stuck. This new machine was the Soviet T-34. At first, German soldiers were shocked by how difficult it was to destroy. Many of the anti-tank weapons used by German units struggled to penetrate the armor of the T-34, especially from longer distances. The tank's sloped armor design helped deflect incoming shells, making it far more resilient than many earlier tanks. German tank crews using Panzer III and Panzer IV vehicles quickly realized that their own guns sometimes had trouble penetrating the T-34's armor unless they were extremely close to the target. The appearance of the T-34 changed the battlefield dramatically. Soviet forces began deploying these tanks in increasing numbers, and they proved capable of fighting effectively even under harsh conditions on the Eastern Front. The wide tracks allowed the T-34 to travel across muddy terrain that often trapped German vehicles. During the autumn and winter months, the Eastern Front became famous for thick mud and freezing snow, which created enormous difficulties for vehicles. German tanks with narrower tracks often struggled to move through these conditions, while the T-34 could continue advancing. Another major advantage of the tank was its powerful gun. The 76mm cannon mounted on the T-34 was capable of destroying many German armored vehicles at long distances. Combined with the tank's speed and strong armor, this made it one of the most balanced and dangerous tanks on the battlefield. German commanders quickly realized that they had underestimated Soviet tank development. Reports from the front lines described encounters where small numbers of T-34 tanks were able to hold off larger German armored units because German shells failed to penetrate their armor. In some cases, German crews were forced to aim carefully at weak points in the tank, such as the rear or the tracks, in order to disable it. These encounters caused serious concern among German military leaders who had previously believed their armored forces were superior to anything the Soviets possessed. The surprise caused by the T-34 was not only due to its armor or its gun, but also because of the way it had been designed for mass production. Soviet engineers created the tank with a focus on simplicity and durability. Many parts were easier to manufacture compared to the complex components used in some German tanks. This allowed Soviet factories to produce large numbers of T-34 tanks even after many industrial facilities were forced to move eastward to avoid the advancing German army. As the war continued, Soviet production increased dramatically, and thousands of these tanks began appearing on battlefields across the Eastern Front. German soldiers soon learned that destroying one T-34 often meant facing another one shortly afterward. The combination of strong design and massive production made the tank a constant presence in many battles. German engineers studied captured T-34 tanks carefully, trying to understand why they performed so well. Many of the design features such as sloped armor and wide tracks impressed German designers and influenced later German tank development. In fact, some historians believe that the appearance of the T-34 forced Germany to accelerate the development of more powerful tanks like the Panther, which also used sloped armor similar to the Soviet design. On the battlefield, the T-34 proved especially effective during large armored clashes where mobility and firepower were critical. Soviet commanders often used these tanks in large numbers to counter German offensives or to launch powerful counterattacks. Even when individual tanks were destroyed, the overall numbers produced by Soviet factories allowed the Red Army to continue fielding strong armored forces. For German tank crews fighting on the Eastern Front, the appearance of the T-34 marked the moment when they realized the war in the East would be far more difficult than expected. The tank represented not only a technological challenge but also a symbol of the Soviet Union's growing industrial power and determination to continue fighting despite enormous losses during the early months of the invasion. As the war on the Eastern Front continued, the T-34 began appearing in greater numbers across Soviet battlefields, and German commanders slowly realized that the tank was not simply a temporary surprise but a major factor that would shape the entire armored war in the East. Soviet factories located far beyond the reach of early German bombing raids were producing thousands of these tanks every year and sending them directly to the front lines. German soldiers who had once believed they would defeat the Soviet Union within a few months were now facing endless waves of new armored vehicles. For many German tank crews, the most frightening aspect of the T-34 was not just its armor or its gun but the sheer number of tanks that appeared in battle. Even if a German unit managed to destroy several Soviet tanks during a fight, more would often appear soon afterward. This constant pressure slowly changed the balance of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. German tank commanders began studying the T-34 carefully and reporting their experiences to military engineers back in Germany. These reports described the strengths of the Soviet tank, including its sloped armor, which allowed many incoming shells to ricochet away instead of penetrating the vehicle. They also mentioned the tank's powerful diesel engine and wide tracks that allowed it to move across rough terrain much more easily than many German tanks. Mud, snow and broken ground often slowed German vehicles, but the T-34 could continue moving even in extremely difficult conditions. German engineers were impressed enough by the design that they began developing new tanks influenced by some of the same ideas. One result of this was the development of the Panther tank, which also featured sloped armor and a powerful gun designed to defeat Soviet armor at long range. Yet while Germany worked on improving its armored vehicles, the Soviet Union continued producing huge numbers of T-34 tanks. By 1943, the Eastern Front was preparing for one of the largest armored confrontations in history. Both sides were gathering enormous forces for a battle that would determine the future of the war in the East. The battle took place near the city of Kursk, where German and Soviet forces prepared for a massive clash of tanks and infantry supported by artillery and aircraft. German commanders hoped that a powerful offensive using their best armored divisions could break through Soviet defenses and restore the initiative on the Eastern Front. However, the Soviet army had spent months preparing defensive positions filled with mines, trenches and anti-tank guns. When the battle finally began, thousands of tanks from both sides entered combat across the fields around Kursk. The T-34 played a major role in this enormous battle. Soviet tank units used large formations of these vehicles to counter German attacks and to launch their own counter-offensives once the German advance began slowing down. The battle quickly turned into a massive armored struggle where tanks fought at close range across open terrain. In some areas dozens of tanks from both sides fired at each other from only a few hundred meters away. German tanks such as the Panther and Tiger possessed powerful guns capable of destroying Soviet armor, but they were often outnumbered by the large formations of T-34 tanks advancing toward them. The combination of numbers, mobility and strong armor allowed the Soviet tanks to remain a serious threat even against some of the most advanced German armored vehicles. The Battle of Kursk eventually became the largest tank battle in history and marked a major turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. After this battle, German forces were never again able to launch large strategic offensives in the east. Instead, they were increasingly forced to defend their positions against growing Soviet attacks. The T-34 continued playing a crucial role in these operations as Soviet armies pushed westward across occupied territory. Another important improvement to the tank came later in the war when Soviet engineers introduced an upgraded version known as the T-34-85. This new model featured a larger turret and a more powerful 85mm gun capable of destroying many German tanks more effectively. The improved firepower allowed Soviet tank crews to fight more successfully against heavily armored German vehicles such as the Panther and Tiger tanks. Combined with the continued mass production of these tanks, the upgraded design made the T-34 an even more formidable opponent during the final stages of the war. As Soviet forces advanced toward Germany, the presence of T-34 tanks became almost constant on the battlefield. These vehicles supported infantry attacks, broke through defensive lines and helped surround retreating German units. Many German soldiers who had once dominated armored battles during the early years of the war now found themselves facing an enemy that possessed both technological strength and overwhelming numbers. The tank that had once shocked German commanders in 1941 had now become one of the most important weapons of the Soviet army. By the final months of the war, thousands of T-34 tanks were moving across Eastern Europe as Soviet forces pushed toward Berlin. The tank had proven itself to be one of the most successful armored vehicles of the entire war. Its combination of mobility, armor protection, firepower and mass production allowed it to remain effective throughout the conflict. For many historians, the T-34 represents one of the most important technological achievements of the Second World War. It changed the expectations of tank design and influenced armored vehicle development long after the war ended. What began as a shocking surprise for German tank crews during the early months of the invasion eventually became one of the most powerful symbols of Soviet resistance and industrial strength. The tank that German soldiers had once struggled to destroy in 1941 would continue fighting until the final victory over Nazi Germany in 1945. By the final years of the war, the presence of the T-34 on the battlefield had become almost overwhelming. Soviet factories had reached incredible production levels, and thousands of these tanks were leaving assembly lines every month. Entire armored armies were now built around the T-34 and its improved versions. These formations moved quickly across the Eastern Front, supporting massive offensives that pushed German forces farther and farther west. For German soldiers who had once advanced rapidly across Soviet territory in 1941, the situation had completely reversed. Instead of launching lightning offensives, they were now retreating while Soviet armored columns advanced across fields, forests and ruined cities. The reliability of the T-34 played a major role in these advances. Unlike many complex machines that required constant maintenance, the T-34 was designed to operate even under extremely harsh conditions. Its simple mechanical systems allowed crews to repair damaged components quickly and return the tank to combat. This durability became especially important as Soviet forces advanced across enormous distances where supply lines could stretch for hundreds of kilometers. Even in freezing winter temperatures or deep mud, the T-34 often continued moving when other vehicles would have stopped. German commanders understood that defeating the Soviet Union would require destroying these armored formations, yet doing so became increasingly difficult as the war continued. German industry attempted to produce more advanced tanks such as the Panther and Tiger, but these machines were complex and expensive to build. While a single Tiger tank could destroy many enemy vehicles in battle, it required far more time and resources to produce compared to the simpler T-34. As a result, Germany could never build these heavy tanks in numbers large enough to match the massive production of Soviet armored vehicles. This imbalance became more obvious during the final campaigns of the war. Soviet armored forces supported major offensives that pushed through Eastern Europe and eventually into Germany itself. During these operations, T-34 tanks led assaults across rivers, through destroyed cities and across open countryside. Their mobility allowed Soviet commanders to move quickly and surround German forces before they could establish new defensive positions. The sight of large formations of T-34 tanks advancing across the battlefield became one of the most recognizable images of the war's final stages. Many German soldiers later described the psychological impact of facing endless waves of Soviet armor. Even when German units possessed powerful anti-tank weapons, the sheer number of enemy vehicles could overwhelm defensive positions. The tank that had first shocked German commanders in 1941 was now helping deliver the final defeat of Nazi Germany. When Soviet forces finally reached Berlin in 1945, thousands of T-34 tanks were among the vehicles that entered the city during the final battle. Fighting through the streets and ruins of the German capital, these tanks supported infantry units as they advanced toward the center of the city. The war in Europe soon came to an end, but the legacy of the T-34 remained. Military historians often describe it as one of the most influential tanks ever built. Its sloped armor, powerful gun and simple construction influenced tank design around the world for decades after the war. More importantly, the tank demonstrated how effective a balanced combination of mobility, protection and mass production could be on the battlefield. For German tank crews who first encountered the vehicle during the invasion of the Soviet Union, the T-34 represented a moment when the war in the East changed dramatically. What had begun as a rapid German advance soon turned into a brutal struggle against an enemy capable of producing powerful weapons in enormous numbers. In the end, the T-34 became one of the symbols of Soviet victory and one of the machines that helped shape the outcome of the Second World War.